It's so easy to think of the Norman conquest as nothing more than William's crossing and the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But of course, it was a much longer, more drawn-out process than that.
William's army travelled on foot and on horseback. It took time to cross England. The Saxons may not have had castles with which to oppose this invasion, but there were a handful of fortified towns, like the walled city of Exeter. It was to become the site of one of the first stone castles built by the Normans. But before that, they would have to lay siege to it. The citizens of Exeter had refused to swear allegiance to William. This is a man who is reputed to have chopped the hands and feet off the defending force of a French town for insulting his mother. William was not a man to cross, and he was marching on their city. William was marauding with an army including 500 cavalry. On the way, he laid waste to parts of Dorset, a forbidding sign for the people of Exeter. Some of the city fathers faltered at the thought and brought him hostages in exchange for striking a deal. But the people of Exeter had other ideas, and they reneged on the arrangement. William set about surrounding the city, cutting it off from supplies. The siege of Exeter had begun.
William and his army approached the city from the northeast, fording a stream called the Longbrook and riding up what is now known as Longbrook Street. At the east gate, William had one of his hostages blinded to show the citizens of Exeter what to expect, but they didn't surrender. And there's even an account that one of them took to the castle walls, dropped his trousers, and farted. The east gate has now been demolished, but you can get a sense from these walls behind me that it was once a formidable obstacle. William had his engineers dig tunnels to try and undermine the walls, and after 18 days, they partially collapsed. It was the beginning of the end for the defenders, but the siege was only broken when Exeter's bishop and his clergy took a Bible and some holy relics to William and made him swear an oath not to sack the city or harm its people.
He kept his word.
To secure his victory, William turned to the castle. He charged Baldwin, Sheriff of Devon, to build Rougemont Castle, so named for the colour of the mound it was built upon and the blocks that were used in its construction.
This gatehouse at Exeter Castle is one of the oldest Norman structures in England. It captures its moment in history perfectly.
What we have here is a pure Norman arch, but above it, two characteristically Anglo-Saxon windows. It's evidence of an Anglo-Saxon building gang working under their new Norman masters.
This marks the arrival of a brand new type of building in England. Stone castles were unlike anything anyone here had ever seen before. The Norman equivalent of the building of the pyramids.
These stone castles were utterly alien, and it's hard to overemphasize the impact of their arrival. Both literally and figuratively, they cast a shadow over their surroundings, a permanent reminder that there was a new boss in town.
The choice of where to build in stone was a carefully considered decision based on strategic importance and the ability to dominate the skyline. Like the Tower of London, designed to strike awe into the people of London. And soon it wouldn't just be the new ruler from across the Channel who erected these imposing edifices across the land.
William set about rewarding his nobles. He divided England amongst his followers and created a new class of Norman baron. Each was given permission to build a castle from which to exert their power.
They were known as the companions of William the Conqueror, men like Robert de Beaumont, who became Earl of Leicester and one of William's most trusted advisors.
From Northumberland to Cornwall, these new barons now were lords of all they could survey from the tops of their castle walls.
And where the barons chose to build their castles was just as important as how they were built. This was not just an invasion of territory, it was an annexation of England's history and its mythology.
In the heart of Cornwall, there's a castle of unique status, Tintagel conjures more imagery in our mind than any other castle in England.
Tintagel is a well-protected site. The name even means the fort of the constriction. But by Richard, Earl of Cornwall's day, any strategic significance was long gone. This land had no military value whatsoever. There hadn't been any fortifications here since the Iron Age. The association with Arthur was to give it a new lease of life. These ruins on a rocky headland exert a power far beyond their physical elements. For a character far more fiction than fact, Arthur holds an extraordinary fascination for us.
It was the cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth who had identified Tintagel as the birthplace of Arthur in the 1100s. A French scholar later added the story of the Round Table, round so that no knight could enjoy higher status than any other. And later writers still added the story of the Holy Grail.
Over the centuries, authors and artists would return again and again to the legend, adding their own ideas.
It's no wonder that dealing with Arthur has been described as dealing with the history of the story of the legend.
The man behind Tintagel Castle had been made Earl of Cornwall by his brother, Henry III. He came from the same Anglo-Norman elite, but he needed to be accepted by the Cornish to make it easier to assert his authority and, more importantly, collect his taxes. It seems that Richard, Earl of Cornwall, was so eager to link his fortunes with those of Arthur that he decided to build his very own Camelot.
Richard decided that this was the exact spot where Arthur was conceived. Don't ask me how he knew. And so the castle had to be built here, just by the cliff's edge. The ruins tell the story of its construction elegantly. Richard built the outer walls first and then filled in this central area to make it level. The only problem was that the walls started to fall towards the sea.
If the castle was to be prevented from falling into the sea, something needed to be done.
Hence these buttresses. They're not tied into the walls, which suggests that they're a later addition. And how did he build his walls? Well, these holes give the answer. They're known as puttlogs, because if you put a log in them, you could then put a plank across as well and create a platform. And then bit by bit, the walls would rise.
But these are thin walls built from the local slate. Looking at them convinces me that this castle had no military value whatsoever. Tintagel's not a fortress, but a purely symbolic edifice. Looking at these evocative ruins, it seems little more than an expensive folly.
And yet Tintagel seems to have served its purpose. The tin in Cornwall made Richard wealthy, and he used that money to enhance his status at every opportunity. He even bribed some German barons to elect him King of the Romans, the first and only time that an Englishman has held that title.
The masons at Carnarvon were working on something that hadn't been seen on these shores before. Edward I's new fortresses had a colonial town built into them. These were known as bastides, an idea taken from Gascony. For Wales, he built the most heavily fortified version possible.
Bastides were a truly colonial idea. They were surrounded by high walls and laid out on a military-style grid system. They were designed to provide both goods and taxes, and were even subject to their own colonial laws.
Bastides were a way of generating income for the project.
But in Wales, the king's new bastide towns had a far more sinister side. The Welsh were cut out, and the English filled the townships.
It was clear, I think, that the building of these new towns represents a process of deliberate Anglicisation of North Wales, bringing in new towns, which the Welsh are totally unaccustomed to, and bringing in new settlers from England.
These civilian settlements formed part of a classic frontier land, hostile territory peopled by a defeated enemy. The last castle Edward built in Wales would be Beaumaris, meaning beautiful marsh. Standing on the island of Anglesey, it was intended to be the crowning glory of the Iron Ring and the finest work of his master mason, James of St George.
Beaumaris was a military masterpiece, planned with an almost impenetrable series of defences. It was based around the idea of concentric walls, essentially building a castle within a castle.
Like so much else, it was a lesson learnt from the great fortresses of the Holy Land.
If you were an attacker and you managed to make it through or over this wall, you'd then be trapped here in a killing zone. You'd face a constant barrage of missiles, and you still had to make it past this even bigger wall. If you were a defender, you could mount a solid defence of the outer walls, firing over the moat, while constantly being protected by covering fire from your comrades here up on the inner wall. But if that outer wall was then breached, you could retreat here. Every time the attackers were slowed down by a new line of defences, whether it was the moat, the outer wall, or the inner wall, they were exposed.
James of St George was now known as the master of the king's works in Wales, and Beaumaris offered him something unique.
Unlike all of the other castles in the Ring of Iron, Beaumaris was built on an entirely new site. It was a blank canvas, and it allowed Master James to build exactly the castle that he wanted. The flat marshland terrain allowed him to build an almost perfectly symmetrical fortress with no compromises in form. More than 2,500 people were brought in to work on this project in the first year alone.
But there was a problem. Castles were enormously expensive, and Edward's brutal wars had almost bankrupted the kingdom. For all its design genius, Beaumaris was never actually finished. Whilst the Tudors may have turned castles into playthings for the fashionable aristocracy, it would be many years before castles entirely lost their military purpose. In 1643, the second year of the English Civil War, one extraordinary woman demonstrated the ongoing military value of castles.
I've come to Corfe Castle in Dorset, probably my favourite castle for its wonderful setting. And it was here that one of the most extraordinary and largely untold stories of the English Civil War took place.
This civil war, fought between Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians and the royalists under King Charles I, caused ancient castles, fortifications, and even town walls to suddenly acquire a value and function that had been almost forgotten. And by 1643, with most of Dorset in the hands of the parliamentary forces, Corfe Castle was holding out as a royalist stronghold. But when its owner, the Lord Chief Justice Sir John Banks, was called away to attend the king, his wife, Lady Mary, assumed control of the castle. And together with her 6 daughters and a force of just 5 men, Lady Mary now prepared to withstand any assault levelled at her.
The first attempts to take the castle were pathetic, to say the least. A small group of parliamentarians pretended to be a stag hunting party, but their ruse was seen through. And then another, astonishingly, pretended to be a group of tourists wanting to look around the castle. But Lady Mary sent them all packing and ordered the gates closed to all comers.
Fearing further and more serious attempts on the castle, Lady Mary stocked up on provisions and called in reinforcements. And it was just in time, because in June 1643, the parliamentarians launched a major siege, with a force of between 500 and 600 Roundheads and 2 siege engines, nicknamed the Boar and the Sow.
The siege ensued for 6 weeks. The parliamentarians were unable to breach the castle walls and proved easy targets for the royalist marksmen. With Lady Mary's garrison commander successfully protecting the outer bailey down there, Lady Mary herself took control of the inner ward up here. Lady Mary was clearly no pushover, and for rebuffing the siege, she gained the nickname Brave Dame Mary.
For the next 2 years, Corfe Castle continued to hold out as a royalist stronghold, but Brave Dame Mary's luck would not last.
One night in February 1646, under cover of darkness, a royalist officer well known to Lady Mary, called Lieutenant Colonel Pitman, arrived here at the southwest gatehouse with what appeared to be a royalist relief force.
But what the welcoming garrison didn't know was that Pitman had already been captured and had turned his coat, switched sides, in order to save his life. The relief force was nothing of the sort, but really parliamentarian soldiers in disguise.
By the time that they realised it was too late, Pitman and about 50 of his soldiers had been granted entry and they set about seizing the castle. After several hours of fighting, Brave Dame Mary and her garrison surrendered.
So Corfe was finally taken, but only by treachery.
In 1747, Walpole had chanced upon 2 cottages known as Chopped Straw Hall, here on the banks of the Thames in Twickenham, and he set about transforming them. "I'm going to build a little Gothic castle," he wrote to a friend, "with battlements, pinnacles, even a great round tower looming large in his vivid imagination." Walpole's Gothic castle took its vast numbers of visitors on something of a mood journey back to the Middle Ages, to ancient strongholds, knights in armour, and all the panoply of chivalry. Walpole wanted the experience to convey feelings of both gloom and warmth, and he even coined a term that conveyed both. Rather brilliantly, he called it gloomth.
Walpole's Gothic castle, which he christened Strawberry Hill, stunned 18th century society. It was unlike anything else in the country and was soon to become a tourist mecca. Walpole delighted in entertaining the gentry, foreign ambassadors, and occasionally even royalty. Such was the public's demand to see Strawberry Hill and sample a bit of gloomth for themselves that Walpole had to confine it to 4 visitors a day, with published rules for their guidance, but strictly no children allowed.
These are visiting cards, and they were recently discovered trapped behind the mantelpiece. And they give you a real sense of people desperate to come in and see this magnificent building. They're written on the back of old playing cards. And this one is from a tea merchant. And as it says, they will be extremely obliged to him to let them see his house at any time this morning. And the name of that tea merchant was Mrs. Twining. perhaps unsurprisingly, living in this fantasy fortress began to rub off on Walpole, for here, one morning in 1764, he awoke from a dream in which he'd imagined himself to be in an ancient castle. Where, on a great staircase, he'd been confronted by a gigantic fist in armour. And so vivid was his dream that later that day, Walpole sat down and began to write a story based on his vision. The book that emerged, The Castle of Otranto, is now widely considered to be the very first Gothic novel, containing all the classic tropes of mystery and horror. It was an immediate success. It sold out across Europe in a matter of weeks, and it led the poet Thomas Gray to comment that it made us all afraid to go to bed at night.
A clap of thunder at that instant shook the castle to its foundations. The earth rocked, and the clank of more than mortal armour was heard behind. The moment Theodore appeared, the walls of the castle behind Manfred were thrown down with a mighty force, and the form of Alfonso, dilated to an immense magnitude, appeared in the centre of the ruins.
With his novel, The Castle of Otranto, and this incredible building, which he described as the prettiest bauble you ever saw, Walpole had combined both the real and the imaginary. His Gothic revival conjured a new romanticised view of the noble castle, one inhabiting both our dreams and our nightmares, and now presiding over a mythic realm.
You could conceive of Strawberry Hill as one great big folly. It inspired other landowners, other patrons, to have the confidence to build their own follies within their landscape. But this was a very desirable thing to have within your grounds. It added an air of history to your landscape, an air of always being there. But it was part of this wider lust for the past, this wider reverence for the medieval past, and a fascination with all things Gothic. But follies gave that kind of romance to your landscape. You could invite your friends, you could even attract tourists to come and see your folly.